Thanks for inviting me to speak to the group. It's sometimes said that falsity is the mark of the devil. So I've always used it as a guideline, a good rule of thumb when assessing the statements made by the devils who run the British establishment, that whatever subject they're talking about, the truth is the exact opposite of what they say. If they say they're going to bring a democracy to a country, it means they're going to crush any possibility of democracy in that country. If they say they're going to save civilians, it means they're going to rain death and destruction down on civilians. And likewise, we have to be aware, if they say that the Arab Spring was something unpredictable that came out of the blue, we have to expect that they were thoroughly prepared for it. I don't say they planned the Arab Spring, I say they planned for the Arab Spring. It was predictable and it was predicted. All the demographic, economic and political trends in the region pointed to a period of prolonged unrest happening in the Arab world, and has been pointing in that direction for some years, especially since the global financial crisis of 2008. The combination on the demographic level of growing youthful populations, rising unemployment, corruption and unrepresentative government made some kind of mass manifestation of frustration and virtual certainty. And this was recognized by a number of people in the British establishment. There was a far-reaching speech delivered in February 2009 by a BP, a former head of BP and turned CIA, showing my indoctrination by the British establishment already. MI6 operative Mark Allen made a speech, which you can find online, where he recognized, we have to prepare for a period of unrest in the Arab world. In August 2010, Barack Obama issued something called the Presidential Study Directive number 11, which noted, I quote, evidence of growing citizen discontent with the region's regimes, and warned that, quote, the region is entering a critical period of transition. This was 4 months before the unrest started in Tunisia, so it was predicted. It wasn't a bolt out of the blue. Now, how did they plan for it? The prospect of this unrest represented both a danger and an opportunity for the imperial powers, including the British ruling class. The danger, of course, was that the unrest would threaten the Gulf monarchies that are more than allies of Britain, or sometimes called allies of the US. But Britain is fundamental to these. They're creations of Britain, creations of British imperialism, the Gulf monarchies. The Saudis, who run Saudi Arabia, the Al Khalifa family, who run Bahrain, the Al Thani family, who run Qatar, have been cultivated by the British establishment for almost 200 years. The Bahraini ruling family that rule currently today became key allies of the British in the early 19th century. The Al Thani since the mid-19th century in Qatar. The Saudis were helped and armed by Britain to capture Riyadh in the first place in 1902. They were given subsidies to extend their influence over the whole region. In 1922, Winston Churchill increased the subsidy paid by the British government to Ibn Saud to £100,000 per year. And in exchange, in 1927, Saudi Arabia ceded control of foreign affairs to the British Empire. Saudi Arabia was then officially created as a country in 1932. And quoting from Mark Curtis, the British historian, to a large extent it was a British creation. So these states are creations of the British Empire. They're not just British allies or US allies, they're creations of the British ruling class. So of course the danger was that these monarchies could be engulfed by the unrest in the region as well. The monarchies, by the way, today's the role today, they serve a number of roles. I mean, the most obvious is suppliers of oil and gas, right? Everyone knows this importance. They've also got a military role as military bases across the region. Famously, the US Fifth Fleet, which is used to intimidate Iran and intimidate the region, is based in Bahrain, off the coast of Bahrain. But they're also crucially a conduit for the cultivation of proxy forces to use against anti-colonial movements across the wider region. And they've served this role for some time as well. So, for example, the weapons in the hands of the Saudis today, much of them was channeled through the Saudis and the Qataris. Also, they've got an ideological importance in the promotion of a very sectarian ideology across the region. It's no coincidence, I think, that the families that the British Empire chose to ally with that still ruled the Arab Peninsula are from the most sectarian strain of Islam that can be found, Wahhabism. Why is this important? Well, we just have to look at what's happening today, but we can also look back to British government records and official documents. A memorandum, for example, from the Foreign Department of the British government of India in 1915 said, I'll quote, "What we want is not a united Arabia, but a weak and disunited Arabia, split up into little principalities so far as possible under our suzerainty, but incapable of coordinated action against us, forming a buffer against the powers in the West." This is the policy still today, divide and rule. You know, everyone has heard the term, but it's important to see how it exactly plays out in the region. And it plays out through funding for these ruling families, who then pass that funding on to promoting sectarian ideology to divide the Arab world and the Muslim world. So it's no coincidence when the revolts across the Arab world started, what was the first thing that's been mentioned by someone from the floor, I think, already. First thing David Cameron did in response was to fly over there and sell weapons to the Gulf monarchies, right? Later on, that was in February of last year, later on in the summer, at the height of the killings in Bahrain against the protesters in Bahrain, the Crown Prince was invited to Number 10 by David Cameron, where a further multi-million arms deal was was arranged. So this is one aspect of, the title was NATO's response to the Arab uprisings. I'm specifically focusing on Britain's response, although the pattern is similar, but not exactly the same across the NATO powers, and notably France and the US. But that was the first element of the British ruling class response, was to prop up the Gulf monarchies that they had established. Also, so that was the danger represented, was that these monarchies might be threatened. The opportunity was it gave the British establishment the opportunity to use the uprisings as cover for long-planned proxy wars against the independent powers in the region, Libya and Syria. Libya, if we look at the history of these countries, you know, very different history from those of Saudi Arabia, Qatar and so on. These are not states established by the British Empire, but states built on movements that grew in opposition to the British Empire, anti-colonial movements. So Libya was once ruled by a British-imposed monarch as well, just like Qatar and Bahrain are today. King Idris, he was overthrown in 1969 by Gaddafi and Gaddafi's supporters. As we know, Gaddafi then, immediately within a year, threw out the British and American bases in Libya, nationalized the oil. In 1973, it was Gaddafi who led the Arab move to boycott boycotts the sale of oil to the West in response to the West's support for Israel, resulting in a quadrupling of oil prices and deeply exacerbating the recession in the West at that time. So, you know, he's not a popular man in the British establishment ruling circles, shall we say. Later in the 70s, the regime became more radicalized. The rest of Libyan industry was nationalized and put under the control of workers' cooperatives. More recently, in the last 10 years or so, Gaddafi's been a leading driving force behind African unity. Driving force behind the creation of the African Union 10 years ago or so. And very importantly and very threateningly for the Western financial elites is the actual money to the tune of $30 billion that Libya had put forward for the three financial institutions of the African Union: the African Central Bank, African Investment Bank, and the African Monetary Fund, not even hiding in the name the potential threat to the International Monetary Fund. It was a serious threat to IMF control of Africa, and this was again yet another reason why it was deemed Gaddafi had to die. This was a government that was not only independent, but actively seeking to promote regional independence and continental independence. This is obviously not acceptable to the imperial powers. And it was Britain, it's really important to note, it was Britain that took the lead, not the US. in the war against Libya. In fact, if you look at the press from the time, you know, it was Cameron who initially suggested the no-fly zone. And actually the US initially, Obama was not very impressed initially by the idea. He was quite reluctant, and actually then Cameron and the British government began briefing the press about how frustrated they were that the US was not taking enough action to save Libyans and so on and so forth. So in a sense, I would argue Obama was reluctant. He was actually essentially intellectually blackmailed by the British ruling class into backing the war against Libya. Obviously not just by the British ruling class, by the American ruling class as well. But what Bush did, this kind of thing Bush did with a psychopathic zeal, Obama is still doing the same things but reluctantly, and he's being pushed and prodded and led by the British. In Syria, obviously Syria was the other worry for different reasons for the Western powers. It's the only really other independent power in the Arab world, I would argue. And the main problem about Syria for the empire, for the British ruling class, and for the US is the obstacle it prevents to an attack on Iran. Syria is allied with both Iran and Hezbollah, the Lebanese resistance movement. And it's known that the biggest obstacle to an attack on Iran is the potential resistance by Hezbollah, the potential retaliation by Hezbollah against Israel in the event of an invasion of Iran. So in 2006, as part of paving the way for the attack on Iran that's to come, in 2006, you know, the Israeli, US financed Israeli attack on Lebanon took place with the aim of destroying Hezbollah, and it failed to do that. So the imperialists have come to understand that war on Iran first requires the destruction of Syria. Why Syria? Well, Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, earlier this year, did an interview in which he said clearly, you know, a large part of the reason for Hezbollah's victory in 2006 was the weapons supplied by Syria. So in order to attack Iran, they have to neutralize Hezbollah. In order to neutralize Hezbollah, they have to destroy Syria. Right? And this is all clearly spelled out in a 2009 strategy document by the influential Washington think tank, the Brookings Institution, called Which Path to Persia, that essentially argues if you want to knock out Iran, you have first to knock out Damascus. That's the argument. So, in order to destroy these governments, it was going to be difficult to do it using the kind of Bush-Blair kind of cowboy tactics of the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Wars in which your own troops get killed are clearly not popular at home. And in the invaded countries, they tend to unite people, whereas what the British establishment are trying to do is divide people. They tend to unite people against you. This was one reason why the British Foreign Office had British Foreign, the FCO is called, Foreign and Colonial Office, or Commonwealth Office. They were against the war in Iraq. It's not a moral problem they had with it, not even a strategical difference, a tactical difference over how to destroy Iraq. To do it through proxies or do it directly. Bush and Blair wanted to do it directly, and it was at a great cost that they managed to succeed in doing that. But the traditional British imperial way, advocated by the Foreign Office, is more than what's happening in Libya and Syria today, using proxies. And the key trick to conducting proxy war is to identify and cultivate a constituency that can be used to undermine that power. To identify the fault lines in the society. This is where the whole British study, the British imperial study of kind of what Edward Said called Orientalism, you find out the intricacies of the culture that you're targeting so that you can find the fault lines and divide and rule. In Libya, the main fault line was race. The roots of anti-black African racism in the Arab world, as in Europe, mainly the result of slavery, Arab enslavement of black Africans, which in Libya, by the way, didn't end until the 1930s. So this is deep. There's a deep racism which manifested some time ago in 2000 in Libya. There were pogroms in which at least 150 black Africans, some of them African migrant workers in Libya, some of them black Libyans, were attacked, lynched by mobs. A number of migrant workers then fled the country and so on. The Egyptian migrant workers, of which there are nearly 1 million, were not attacked. Just the black migrant workers and, as I say, black Libyans in Libya. There's an interesting article in The Economist at the time, which commented that Libyans, this is the quote, Libyans will be hoping that they have not just ousted the migrants, but have also ousted Colonel Gaddafi's hated Pan-Africa policy. One wonders if that means Libyans hope this, or The Economist is hoping this. But clearly a cleavage had been identified, a fault line in Libyan society, that racists could be cultivated as an anti-Gaddafi force. The pogrom was effectively supported by kind of public statements blaming migrants for disease and crime and so on. It was effectively supported by two of Gaddafi's ministers, who were immediately then sacked by Gaddafi. And it's instructive to note that one of these two then reappeared last year as the third most powerful member of the NATO handpicked Transitional Council. So these are the people they are cultivating. They identified that fault line of race in Libya, and they realized they could cultivate racism. And it was, you know, the character of the Libyan uprising from the first day was an anti-black pogrom. The so-called rebels, this is on the very first day of the uprising. You know, a lot of people have put out that, oh, sort of, you know, once NATO got involved, it sort of got sidetracked and got dodgy. This wonderful rebellion started out great and then got, you know, diverted by NATO. No, it's not true. From the very first day, something called Beda in Libya, 50 African migrants were locked in a prison that was taken over by the rebels and tortured to death for no crime other than being black-skinned. One of the brigades, the key rebel groups in Benghazi, is called the Brigade for the Purging of Black Skins. This is the group that's now been sent into Bani Walid to destroy Bani Walid. Yeah, that's right. So these are the forces cultivated by Britain, and it was mainly Britain. The main force on the ground in Libya, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, they've been effectively headquartered in London since 1996, when they launched a failed uprising, and at the same time, again, MI6 collaborated with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in a failed assassination attempt against Gaddafi. So they've been based here in this country, and Britain and the US also used the rapprochement, so-called, with Libya as a way to try and cultivate elements within Gaddafi's government who they could then use. People like Jibril, Abdul Jalil, who became the leading figures in the transitional government. So they built this coalition, and the point I'm making, this was not a spontaneous response to an uprising in the Arab world. This is long planned over 10 years to cultivate these forces that could be used against Libya. A combination of turncoats in Gaddafi's government, racist lynch mobs, and the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Been carefully cultivated over a long time. In Syria, the plans go even further back. In 1957, it was recently unearthed a plan for a proxy war against Syria. You can read about this online. There's an excellent article in the Morning Star, in fact, exposing this. 57, Prime Minister Macmillan and President Eisenhower had a plan to launch a proxy war against Syria, carry this out under the cover of internal disturbances. But they would be proxy forces directed by Western intelligence. In Syria, the key cleavage, the key fault line was not race as religion, so much as religion. You know, the fragile nature of the Syrian state, potentially, I wouldn't actually overdo the fragile element. I mean, the different religious groups in Syria coexisted perfectly peacefully for decades. It's not like, I wouldn't go along this line that, you know, it's sort of fundamentally unstable. But certainly there are differences which can be exacerbated along religious lines between Sunni and Shia Muslims, but also Christians. And this is the way that the US and Britain have cultivated specifically those sectarian militias, anti-Shia sectarian militias, to send in, often they're not even Syrian, to send in from Saudi, Jordan, Turkey, to send in to destabilize Syria. It's interesting, in Syria, the leader of the National Coordinating Committees, one of the main groups organizing the initial wave of peaceful protests in Syria, has said, look, he doesn't support the arming of the rebels, the militarization. He doesn't support the rebels, the Syrian National Council that claims to represent Syria abroad. He doesn't support the Free Syrian Army that is launching the attacks within Syria. So the very people that the West is claiming to be so concerned about are actually against the West's current strategy of arming, militarizing the conflict. There was another aspect to sending in these sectarian militias against Syria. There's an excellent piece by Seymour Hersh from 2007 called "The Redirection" that you should read if you haven't read it. He says, he quotes actually from a US government consultant. This was at the time in 2007 when US and British forces in Iraq were facing increased hostility from Sunni militias in Iraq. Now, US government consultant Hersh interviewed, he said, and I quote, he said, "It's not that we don't want the Salafis, the militant Sunnis, to throw bombs. It's who they throw them at. Hezbollah, Muqtada al-Sadr, Iran, and at the Syrians if they continue to work with Hezbollah and Iran." This whole idea was that we can take some of the heat off our forces in Iraq if we can redirect these Sunni militants into a sectarian genocidal war against the Shia of the region, which will also help prepare the ground for a war with Iran by destroying the last allies of Iran in the region and disempowering the Shia of the region that would otherwise ally with Iran. There's a whole bunch more stuff to say about this, but I think my time is up, so thank you.